So first, I'd like to introduce Jay Bryson, Wells Fargo Chief Economist. And Melissa Kankov, Tech Diversity, Community, and Sustainability Head of External Engagements. Please join me in welcoming them. Sorry, Jay.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Come on, high tech. Can y'all hear me? That's it. I know y'all are being very reserved right now, so hopefully, you know, as the day goes on, we'll get a little bit more comfortable. Familia.
Do you want me to
And this is, you want to switch? Or
No, yeah, you
okay.
do it.
Okay. Jay Bryson, Chief Economist at Wells Fargo.
Well, thank you, everyone, and thanks for inviting us here. So what I'm going to talk about is shows my title slide here. I'm going to talk a little bit about our outlook for the U.S. economy over the next year or two, and then some of the implications of that outlook, not only in the short term, but also in the longer term, some of the implications for the Hispanic and Latino community. So let's kind of start where the U.S. economy is, and one way to measure that is through GDP growth, okay? And so what this chart shows us, those bars shows us the quarterly growth rates and an annualized rate. And, you know, the scale got kind of blown out with the pandemic, right? You see, you know, the big collapse there in activity. And then when the economy opened back up again, you know, it kind of surged. But over the last year or so, you can see growth has slowed. In the second quarter, real GDP expanded only about 1%. And just to put that number into perspective, if you go back to 2010, 2019, you know, that long economic expansion, on average, we expanded about 2.25% per year. So in the second quarter, at least, we were doing about half that. So, you know, the good news is we're still expanding. The bad news is that's kind of at a sluggish pace. Now, you know, the big question, obviously, is what it has to, you know, with inflation. We all know what's going on there. And, you know, when you look at the chart here, I'm showing you two lines. So the red line is the overall rate of CPI inflation, and then the blue line is what's called the core rate, and that excludes food and energy, not because they're not important, it's just because they're really volatile. And, you know, when you look at, you know, when you look right here, the blue line's the core, the red is that overall rate, and you can see that, you know, the red line just jumps around a lot more. So the core, what that does is it shows us kind of where the trend rate is. And it still accounts for about 80% of the goods and services. So the good news is when you look at the overall inflation rate, it's come down. Last summer, that was up at 9%. That's the highest it's been since the early 1980s. I mean, now it's down to about 5% or so. And tomorrow, we will get the CPI report for April. It prints at 8:30 Eastern time tomorrow. And then the blue line, you can also see, has come down, but that's still running around 5% or so. And so good news, it's come down. The bad news, it still remains kind of elevated. And so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to drill down a little bit more into that core rate to show you where the inflation's coming from. So keep in mind, this overall core rate's about 80% of the goods and services. And so the first thing we're going to look at here is what's called core goods, okay? So this would be all goods in the economy excluding food and energy. So, you know, examples would be, you know, the coat that I'm wearing here, you know, the iPhone that you have, the shoes you're wearing, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And what you see here is if you look at the blue line, that's showing you is the year-over-year growth rate, okay, or the year-over-year change. And starting in about 2021 up to last year, you can see that thing rose. And early last year, that was up north of 10%. And so what was going on there is, so remember, think back to 2020, 2021. Economy is more or less shut down. But people have all these stimulus checks, and, you know, being Americans, we like to go out and spend it, right? But the service sector was largely shut down. People weren't going to restaurants, they weren't traveling around, et cetera, et cetera. So where did they spend it on? They spent it on goods. So the demand for goods really goes up. Okay, at the same time, that's where all the supply cutbacks in the economy were, the supply constraints. So what happens when demand really goes up and supply really comes down? If you don't remember your Econ 101 from college days, I'll give you the answer. Prices go up, and they go up dramatically. Okay, and now if you look at the last year, look what that line has done. It's come back down. As a matter of fact, in March, on a year-over-year basis, the prices of goods was up only 1%, because now we're getting a swing back, right? So what the pandemic did is pulled a lot of good spending forward, right? You know, people had to get the kids out of the house. What did they do? They went out and they bought a basketball hoop or a trampoline. How many of those things do you really need, right? You know, so that just pulled all that spending forward. And so now demand for goods has really slowed down. At the same time, I'm not going to say supply chains are back to 100%, but they're a lot better than they were. And so demand has slowed, supplies come back online. What's happened to prices? Prices have moderated. So that's good news, and but that's only 20% of the CPI. Now I'm going to show you 60. This is services. Anybody see any disinflation there? It's running 7% year over year. Now maybe it's topped out, but it hasn't really come down. So just to get inflation back to 2% where the Fed kind of wants it to be, just do the math. You got to have this thing come down, okay? And so how do you do that? Well, when you think about most service providers, their biggest cost component is wages and salaries. And I'll show you a wage chart here in just a minute, but essentially what you need to do is you need to have growth in wages and salaries moderate. Okay, now I didn't say wages and salaries have to come down, but the growth rate has to moderate in order to bring that down. And the way you do that is by generating, I'll use a euphemism here, you generate some slack in the labor market. In other words, you need to have the unemployment rate come up a little bit. Okay, and that's what the Fed has been. That's what the Fed, with all its interest rate hikes, has been trying to do. It's been trying to slow the economy enough to bring down demand for labor, to bring wage growth back into line. Okay, so how are we doing on that score? So here's the unemployment rate. This just printed last Friday. In April, the unemployment rate was at 3.4%. It's essentially a 50-year low. Okay. When you look at wages, there's lots of different ways to measure that, but this is probably the best measure we have. It's what's called the Employment Cost Index. This is a quarterly data point, but as you can see in the first quarter, that was running about 5% year over year. And just look where this thing was, you know, back during the last decade. Right? We are significantly above that. 5% wage growth is not consistent with a 2% inflation rate, okay? And so that's why the Fed has tightened as much as it has. And just to show you our forecast here, the Fed has tightened rates or brought rates up by 500 basis points in 14 months. That's the fastest pace of tightening. You have to go back to the early 1980s when we also had an inflation problem back there. Our sense is the Fed's probably done at this point. Now, if there's a risk to that forecast, I would say the risks are skewed more to the upside. That is, I think there's a higher likelihood that they would raise rates, at least in the short term, rather than cutting rates. But we also think the next time they meet, which will be in June, we think they'll pause at that point. They've done a lot at this point. And it's time to sit back, look at the incoming data, see how the economy's evolving. And so we think they're done, but we also don't think they're going to be cutting rates anytime soon. It's a little bit difficult to tell from this chart, just because of the long time series, but we essentially think they're on hold all year, that they won't be cutting rates until early next year. And that's the reason they're going to be cutting rates early next year is going to be something I'm going to talk about in just a minute here. Okay, so we're in for high interest rates, we think, for a little bit of period of time, and then next year, as you can see, we think they bring it down significantly. So not only do you have interest rate increases in the pipeline out there, but what you also have is when you look at bank loans, and so what I'm showing you here is a year-over-year growth rate in bank loans. That's slowing. Okay, now in April, so this is a weekly series. And if you look at mid-April relative to last April, that's up about 9% or so on a year-over-year basis. Okay, but you can also see that a few months ago that was growing stronger than that. And this is, 52 weeks. If I look at a shorter time frame, if I look at the last 13 weeks, which is a quarter, if I go back a quarter and look at the rate of change over the last quarter, it's only about 3%. Bank loans are really slowing, in part because what has happened in the banking system over the last month or two. I mean, no one here in this room is probably surprised about, or everyone knows about what's happened to some of the regional banks. And so there's a credit tightening that's going on in the economy right now. And so, the combination of higher interest rates, the combination of it's more difficult to get credit means the following chart. We think that, the U.S. is looking at a recession. Now, we were one of the first Wall Street banks to start calling for a recession. We started doing that sometime last summer. And full disclosure, we've had to push off the timing of that because the economy has been much more resilient than what we thought. Now, when I mentioned the word recession, everyone kind of takes a deep breath and, right? Because it's not a good word. And when you think about the last two recessions, they've been pretty nasty. So let me put this one in perspective. So what we're looking at here is, as you can see, is 3 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. By the way, that's not what a recession is defined at. I'm not going to bore you with the technical definition. But we think the economy is going to contract for about 3 quarters, and the peak to trough decline is about 1%. Okay? Now, I know that doesn't mean anything to anybody in this room. Okay, so let's put that into perspective. If you go at the last recession, that was the pandemic. That was only 2 quarters, but it was 10%. It was the deepest recession the economy has had since the Great Depression. Okay, 10%. What we're looking at here is on the order of about 1%. And, let's face it, let's hope, the pandemic, God willing, is a once in a generation, if not once in a century sort of phenomenon. It was more of a healthcare crisis than it was an economic crisis. So go back to the one before that. Go back to the financial crisis. 6 consecutive quarters of negative growth, peak to trough decline, 4%. Again, we're looking for 3 quarters, roughly 1% or so. As recessions go, this is relatively modest sort of recession. Now, I've been talking about GDP growth in terms of a recession. If I go out here to Mission Street and grab 100 people at random and I say, tell me about a recession, unless they're a nerdy economist like myself, they're probably not going to talk about GDP growth. They're going to talk about the labor market. GDP doesn't mean anything to them, but the labor market certainly does. Okay, and so one way to measure that would be the unemployment rate. Right now, the unemployment rate is roughly 3.5%. We think by sometime early next year, that will be close to 5%. So that's a change of 1.5 percentage points. How does that stack up? Again, if you look at that chart right there, you can see, the financial crisis. We went from 4.5% to 10. That's a delta of 5.5 percentage points. Here we're talking a delta of 1.5. So again, as recessions go, this is relatively mild, modest, whatever you want to call it. Why is that? Lots of different reasons. I could show you lots of different charts, but I'll show you one which I think gets to the point of it. And what I'm looking at now is the household sector. This is household liabilities measured as a percent of income. Okay, so people refer to this as leverage. Okay, and so you see that Mount Everest there in the middle of the chart? That is the housing bubble, when Americans got all levered up. Look what we've been doing for the last 15 to 20 years. We've been de-levering. Okay, as a matter of fact, this ratio is back to where it was before the housing bubble started to inflate. The household sector is not levered up right now. And a long time ago, in a galaxy far away, I was a professor of economics. I know how to give letter grades. If I had to give a letter grade to the household, the financial position of the household sector right now, it'd be a solid B, maybe a B+. 15, 20 years ago, it was a D. and I didn't like to fail people, so I was being nice there with that. So again, the system is just not levered up right now, and therefore, everything else equal, we wouldn't expect it to be a really nasty recession. All right, so what does this mean for the Hispanic and Latino community as we kind of go forward? So I talked about the unemployment rate. So what I'm showing you here on the left-hand side is, so the red line is the overall national unemployment rate, and the blue line is the Hispanic unemployment rate. And you can see that that has generally, the Hispanic unemployment rate has generally been above the national one over the last 30-some years or so. The chart on the right shows you the difference. And what's interesting when you look at that, if you go back 30 years ago, the Hispanic Latino unemployment rate was roughly 3 percentage points above. Today, it's only about 1 percentage point above. Okay, so that has come down over time. What's also interesting, though, when you look at that chart, I don't know how well you can see these things, but there's like gray vertical bars in that chart. Okay, that marks recessions. And what you see is the Hispanic unemployment rate goes up more than the national rate during recessions. Okay, so what that means is if we do have a recession, if we're right and there is a recession, we'd expect the unemployment rate in the Hispanic and Latino community to go up more. Why is that? So when you look at labor for where Hispanics work and what sort of industries, so what I'm showing you here on the left is, whoops, don't go back. What I'm showing you here on the left is, I'm sorry. Right, if you look at this red line right here, Hispanics and Latinos account for about 18% of the labor force today, okay? And then what these blue bars show you is different industries and how much they account for in that industry. So if you look at the top, okay, Hispanics and Latinos account for about more than 30% of the jobs in the construction industry. Probably not a great surprise, okay? If you want to look at tech, and I've circled them here. So what is tech? It's, it depends on what you define it as. But if it includes, hardware and things of that nature, that would be durables manufacturing, which is this guy right here. So as you can see, that blue bar is below the red line. So underrepresented in that in durables manufacturing, which there's a lot of things in there. And then if you do if you look at software, that would be in this information thing. And again, that's real short there as well. Okay, but the point here is Hispanic and Latino workers are concentrated or tend to be overrepresented, I should say, in cyclically sensitive industries. Okay, and so if you look at this chart here on the right, what this is showing us, I'm looking at the last 3 recessions. And the 0 is when the recession starts, the 0 line on the left is when it starts. And if you look at this chart on the top, this shows you what happens to employment over the last 3 recessions. You can see over the course of about a year or so, it goes down by about 2%. Okay, now you look at construction, transportation, and warehousing, and non-durable goods. Okay, so these would be, if you look at the left-hand side, where Hispanic workers are overrepresented, they go down a lot more. Again, these are cyclically sensitive sort of industries. So again, I would expect the unemployment rate to go up more. Now, that's a short-term view of the world. If you look at a longer-term view, what I'm showing you here now is the level of real GDP in the economy. This goes back 40 years. So this is the size of the economy. It's measuring goods and services in volume terms, not in dollar terms, in volume terms. And what it shows us is over the last 40 years, the size of the US economy has trebled. We produce 3 times as much goods and services today as we did 40 years ago. And when you look at the recessions, except for the pandemic, it's kind of just a little bit of a blip. Yes, recessions happen. They're painful when they do, but it's not the end of the world. The economy continues to grow. And I would expect that the US economy will continue to grow. And as I'm going to finish up here with, Hispanics will have a big role in that. Left-hand chart shows you population growth rates over the last century or so, okay, and by decade. The gray bars, we didn't have racial or ethnic breakouts before 1990. But if you look at the last few decades or so, the blue is growth rate, that what it's accounting for by the Hispanic community. Red is everybody else. And even though today Hispanics make up only 20% of the US population, in the last expansion they accounted for more than half of the labor force growth rate. And that's really important for long-term economic growth, because the more workers you have, the faster the economy can grow everything else. Another thing, when you look at the demographic breakdown, blue is Hispanic, red is everybody else, and prime age, close to 70% of Hispanic Latino workers are prime age. The community is younger than the overall population, okay, and that's really, really important. When you look at labor force participation by ethnicity, what I'm showing you here is, if you look, so blue would be Hispanic and Latino, red is non-Hispanic. And if you look at the far left there, the labor force participation rate, so these would be people 16 and over who are participating in the labor force. They're either working or actively looking for a job. Okay, my 91-year-old father is not part of that. He is not working, nor is he actively looking for a job, okay? So he's not part of the labor force. But people who are 16 and over, either working or actively looking for a job, or part of the labor force, Hispanics in general have a higher labor force participation rate. What's interesting, when you break it out then by gender, you can see that here are men, these are prime age men, so these would be men 25 to 54. Here are women. Hispanic women actually are underrepresented, have lower labor force participation rates. Probably a lot of reasons for that, but what's interesting when you drill down even further, and you look at the labor force participation rate for Hispanic women of childbearing and child rearing ages. So these would be, say, between early 20s to mid 40s or something like that, early 50s. What you see there is those labor force participation rates are actually lower. And I have a hypothesis, and I'll show you in just a second, don't know exactly why, but average income in general in the Hispanic community, I'll show you this in a second, is actually a little bit lower. And so many people can't afford childcare. And so they are kind of forced to stay home. And so there's a big public policy imperative to do something about childcare in our country, because it definitely would help to raise the labor force participation rates. Another good piece of news as you continue to go forward, you look at educational attainment. The blue bars would be people with high school diplomas. If you go back, was that back to 1990, turn of the century, less than 60% had, and this is in the Hispanic and Latino community, less than 60% had high school diplomas. Today, that's around 75%, and you can see the red bars is college-educated Hispanic and Latinos. That has also come up as well significantly. That rate has doubled over the last 20-some years. Okay, so obviously more and more people of Hispanic and Latino ancestry are going into higher and higher paying jobs, and to that point, this is what's happening too. This is Hispanic real median household income measured as a percent of the national average, and you can see recently how that's done. That's 82% right now. Okay, so that's really kind of coming up, and probably I would think would probably continue to, at least in a long-term sort of sense. So just to wrap up here, the U.S. economy is expanding right now. We don't think that's going to last. We think by later this year, end of this year, we're going to be looking at a relatively modest sort of recession. Unemployment rate in general will come up across the country. I wouldn't be surprised to see the unemployment rate among Hispanics and Latinos come up even more, just because of the cyclical sensitive nature that many work in. But in a longer term sense, I think that the outlook for the community is very, very good, given some of these underlying factors that we talked about. And Hispanics will continue to be a driving force in the U.S. economy in the years and decades to come. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay, for those economic insights. And if anyone wants to start queuing up to ask any questions, please feel free to do so now. But one of the things that came to mind for me, many of the folks in this room, including myself, may be first generation corporate citizens. And we have families that look to us to help to support them. It's a heavy weight that we carry when we are fortunate enough to have these roles, which is why we need everyone here to bring more people into technology so we can make it more diverse and create more wealth creating jobs for people. Yes, that's applause worthy. So what economic indicators should we be watching in order to protect the investments that we've made so far, given the economic insights?
So I guess what I would say would be, I think the number one thing to be watching is inflation going forward. Inflation erodes purchasing power. If your wages and salaries don't keep up with inflation, your purchasing power gets eroded. But also, there is an empirical finding in the economic literature, and that is high inflation rates are also correlated with very variable inflation rates, and that has a really negative impact on long-term GDP growth. I mean, if a business person or knows that the inflation rate's going to be 2-3% stable over a long period of time, it's really easy to plan, or easier to plan in that sort of environment. And so then that brings about capital investment. Capital investment helps to drive productivity growth, which in the long run sense helps to drive real income growth. We all benefit when inflation's lower. But when it's jumping, when it's high, it also tends to jump around a lot. And so one year it's 5%, the next year it's 15%, then it's down to 8%, then it shoots up to 17%, et cetera, et cetera. It's really hard to plan in that sort of environment. That hurts capital investment, and then in a long-term sense, that hurts long-term economic growth. So for me, the biggest thing is inflation, and that's why the Federal Reserve, I mean, nobody likes higher interest rates, but that's why the Fed is very, very serious about trying to rein this inflation in. They go back and they look at the history of the last few decades or so. They've studied the 1970s, and they say, you know what, we're not going to make that mistake again, because we let inflation get out of control in the early to mid-1970s, and then it took a really deep and nasty recession in the 1980s to bring it to heel. So,
thank you for that. Yep. And I can't really see, but I think we have some folks. Hey, G, how are you?
Hey there. How you doing? I'm Edgar. Thank you, Jay, for that presentation. A lot of really interesting data there to digest. I wondered about your thoughts on student loan forgiveness and the pause, and if your household income to debt ratio numbers took into account what's going to happen when the pause ends. I believe Hispanics account for about 20% of borrowers. FSA, who manages it, it's $1.6 trillion portfolio, which is approaching Citibank and Wells Fargo. So just wondering what your thoughts are in terms of what's going to happen when that pause ends. A lot of people may not be able to pay it back. And so was that accounted for when you came up with these figures? Thank you.
Yep. So if you went back and looked at that chart that I showed you, it showed you the debt to income ratio, the leverage chart. If we just said, if we took student loans out of that chart and redid the chart would come down a little bit, but it wouldn't be meaningful. 70% of household debt is mortgage debt. The other 30% is split up equally between what's called revolving debt, credit cards, and non-revolving debt. So that would be, so non-revolving debt is a lot of different stuff, but the two biggest ones would be car loans and student loans. So when overall, when you look at student loans, it's a relatively small, I mean, for some people, and I'm going to stress some people, it's a big deal, right? But for the aggregate economy, it's not that big of a deal in and of itself. You do hear horror stories of somebody who's borrowed $200,000 or whatever. The median amount of student debt is actually only $20,000. it's a big deal for a small group of people. And if it's, you know, if it's not, you know, if people have to go start paying it again, yet will it be painful for the people who have to pay a lot of student debt? Yeah, obviously, right? Is that in and of itself going to put the economy into a recession? The answer is probably not. Because here's another interesting statistic. When you look at income cohorts or deciles, if you look at the top 10%, so this would be 90 to 100, those people account for 46% of consumer spending in the economy. If you go down another decile, 80 to 90, they account for another 14%. The top 20% account for 60% of the consumer spending in the economy. Now, that says something about the income distribution in our economy, and I'm not going to opine on that, okay? But the point is that people with a lot of student debt probably aren't up at those top sort of, you know, if you're in the 80 to up and above, you probably don't have boatloads of student debt. And so, you know, if you could tell me with 100% certainty everybody has to start paying it back tomorrow, how would our change our forecast? I don't know, maybe we'd shave you know, our GDP growth numbers down by 1/10 or 2/10, but it wouldn't be, if we weren't looking at a recession before, it was not like I would say, oh my gosh, now we've got a recession. So.
Thank you. And Guillermo has a question.
So, you know, one of the strong beliefs that we have in high tech is that we want to build the pipeline from the classroom to the boardroom. If you look at this room, it's filled with incredible talent. And I remember in 2007 when it was just a couple of tables. I was looking at your chart. If we build the pipeline, it starts with the classroom. And one of the charts that shows Hispanic educational attainment shows the continuous sort of uptick of high school graduates. Mm-hmm. And over the last 3 years, it shows sort of a leveling off of the college graduates. Any insight to that?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't know the real answer to that. My sense would be, and this would be only my sense, and it wasn't only in high school, it's also in college as well. My sense may be...
So the high school continues to tick up a bit, but college starts to level out.
But my sense may be it may be related to the pandemic. You know, people, you know, they go home, they weren't in the classroom, they go home, they're doing Zoom calls, maybe they kind of drop out. And I think in general, colleges have seen some weakness there as well. But I think in a long-term sort of sense, I wouldn't want to really draw firm conclusions over the last few years. I'd want to see a few more years before I started to do that. And I look at that trend line there. I look at the trend line, I look at what's happening to income growth in the Hispanic and Latino community. Those things are really correlated. Right, and so, you know, as long as you know, people have more income today and wealth today than what they did 15 years ago, willing to go to college, and with, you know, the trend increase in the high school graduations, that should continue to push up college enrollment as well. So, I think in a long-term sort of sense, I think that's going to continue to go up.
Yes, good afternoon. I am curious about your thoughts on careers for the young labor market, right, the labor force. When trying to optimize the less cyclical fields, right, for the next 10 years, what would be some areas of growth, like the top 5 areas of growth that you would see in the labor market, in terms of demand?
Right. What's the top areas of growth? So I'll tell you what they are right now. One of the biggest areas of growth, and this is probably not going to come to any surprise to anybody in here, is healthcare. We're getting older. Older people need more and more healthcare, right? So that's a big one. Another big one is it's a big category. It's called professional and business services. And what is that? There's a lot of different things in there, but, you know, consulting would be things like in that sort of area as well. I think a really interesting thing in here, and I know some of you folks are probably working on all this, is AI. What does that do? Is that a threat, or is that is that something good? I'm just starting to study it, and I don't know where I land on that. I mean, I guess I tend to be jar is half full sort of person, and I tend to think it's good in a long-term sense. You know, I think of the Industrial Revolution. This is like another Industrial Revolution that's coming at us. And you go back and you look at the Industrial Revolution, if you read the history of that, that was very, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, that caused just a lot of volatility, right? I think AI is going to be the same thing, but when you go back and you look at the Industrial Revolution, it was the best thing that could have happened to humankind because it raised productivity. And so will AI displace many jobs? Yeah, probably. But it will probably also create new jobs that we can't even think of right now. And I think the long-term solution to that, and it gets back to the question that was asked earlier, it's education, right? We got to keep, and so what we need, if this displacement is coming at us, what we need is, in this country, is smart public policy. And I understand that may be an oxymoron at this point in time, right? But we need smart public policy to get us through the next few decades as this displacement is occurring. In the long run, I think it's good, but in the short term, I think it could be very unsettling. So.
And I'd like to quickly interject with something that I learned last week. An AI prompt engineer starting salary is $475,000.
Oof. Wow.
So we need to get our kids in AI quickly.
And one other thing, before I went down that rabbit hole of AI, one other thing that's a big jobs creator right now is data science sort of stuff. So if you folks have any kids who are in high school or something like that, they're wondering what to do, you probably already know this, but I'm going to hammer this home. Take as much math as you can and as much statistics, because that stuff is really in demand right now.
Thank you. My question is regarding the women, the number of women that are working as they get age into when they have children, the child-rearing years. If we wait for the policies of the country to come together to provide childcare, we're going to be waiting for a while. Are you aware of any plans that companies like Wells Fargo are pursuing to provide more childcare so more women can participate in the working environment?
So as it relates to Wells Fargo, I'm not ducking your question. I honestly don't know what we have in terms of that right now. But I do know that more progressive, cutting-edge companies, many which are probably represented out here, are doing more and more of that. And I think as we go forward, the labor market is going to remain tight, just because we are an aging society at this point. And it's going to become imperative to many companies to be able to provide that child care in order to attract workers and get workers. So I think it's a long, slow process. I don't know of any things that are in front of Congress right now, to do that. But I think it's probably going to be something that the private sector is going to be taking a leading role in. And again, I think many companies that are represented here are kind of on the cutting edges of that. And I think you'll start to see more and more companies follow suit.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Elia. My question is, I know you mentioned that one's salary should keep up with the rate of inflation. If inflation is like, say, 3 to 4% at the moment, should your salary grow like 4 to 5%, like just a percent above inflation, or should it grow like double that, quadruple that per year? to account for year-over-year, like, inflation growth. You know what I mean?
All right, so show of hands, how many people think it should go double that?
It should.
So if you look over long periods of time, over the last few decades or so, real income, so that would be the dollars you make minus the inflation rate, that has averaged around 1 to 1.5% a year. Now, that's because the economy has slowed down. So back when productivity growth was really slow, so if I go back to the 90s, when productivity growth was a lot faster back then, it was growing more like 2% a year. So somewhere between 1 to 2% is kind of the run rate of what real income should be growing for somebody's economy like ours today. And the way to really bring that about is, I've mentioned this word before, it's productivity. And just to define that, what that is, it's the number of goods and services that a person can make in an hour. Okay, so I'll give you an example. If you could make, we'll call it widgets. If you could make 4 widgets, and last year you made 4 widgets an hour, and this year you can make 5 widgets an hour, then what happens is that's going to create income for somebody somewhere. Okay, if you're being the real productive worker, your salary could go up by that 20%, 25% because of that. Okay, if your boss is a real ogre and decides not to pay it to you and keeps it for themselves, well, that's income for somebody. It's the income for the boss. Or if the company is publicly held, then it's income for the shareholders. Okay, if it doesn't go to you and it doesn't go to the boss, then what happens? The company cuts its prices, and then that's income for everybody. So productivity growth sometimes gets a bad rap, but productivity growth is always and everywhere good. And the biggest driver of productivity growth is technological change. And it goes back to AI. AI is a technological game changer. And if AI, really becomes part of the economy, and we can figure out all the displacement challenges and everything, we could potentially go back for real income growing 2.5% a year, where that means that you can buy every year 2.5% more goods and services, not in dollar terms, in volume terms. And so, again, there's a big promise for AI, because that's the game changer that could potentially be out there.
And I think we have one more question.
Yes, thank you for the information and the analysis, very insightful. One question that I have is regarding the offshore services. In the sector of services, what will happen with the offshore in these times of crisis? It will decrease, it will increase, or what is the role that it will play?
Yeah, so in terms of, what's happening right now is there's a lot more onshoring and nearshoring that's occurring. We wrote a series of reports earlier this year, and if you'd like to read them, they're on our website, wellsfargo.com/economics, about the retreat of globalization. We had 3 decades or so of globalization. That's going now in reverse, and largely because of geopolitical sort of factors. The pandemic helped bring it, helped accelerate it, but I think it's capping out. And so what we're going to see is a lot more manufacturing coming, if not to the United States, perhaps to Mexico and Central America. Leaving China because of geopolitical concerns, and China is no longer a low-cost place to do stuff, and coming back to the United States. So I am really bullish about the long-term prospects for the manufacturing sector in the United States. I'm just not really bullish on manufacturing employment, because that'll all be done by automation, right? Robots and things of that nature will be that. I think it's good, again, for the near shores, the Mexicos, the Central Americas, places of that nature. And so it'll have profound effects kind of on the workforce as we go forward. But more and more of that offshoring now is kind of coming back online. So.
Do we have time for one more question? I can't see the high-tech folks or Lisa. But I know we're already over a bit. Yes, no? Let's do it.
Yeah, just a quick question. Could you play devil's advocate to your prediction that we will see a decline in GDP later this year? Or in other words, could you provide arguments that there won't be a recession?
Yeah, so what I should have said during my thing is, so I'm not clairvoyant, right? I mean, just because I think there's a recession doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen, right? It's not 100% probability. So if I had to handicap it right now, I would give it, if you say, what's the probability of recession in the next year, I would say, 2/3 weight, 65%. Recession, 35%. The Fed sticks a soft landing. What the Fed needs to do, again, it needs to generate some slack in the labor market. The good thing that we've seen in the last few months is that labor force participation rate that I've told you about. That participation rate over the overall economy, that's coming back up. That got hammered during the pandemic. It's starting to come back up. And if that continues to come higher, then the supply of labor could potentially outstrip the demand for labor, and that will bring wages into check. The problem with that is the Fed really doesn't have any tools to control that. And nor does, really in the short term, the federal government have much it can do about that as well. So it's kind of I'll call it a wing and a prayer. It's a hope, keeping your fingers crossed, that the labor force participation rate comes up. And that very well can happen. I just don't think it's credible to think that that's it's going to keep us from having a mild recession here. But a year from now, if I'm fortunate enough to be invited back, I could be saying mea culpa, I was wrong, sorry. You're only as good as your last forecast. So.
Thank you so much, Jay. Thank you for being here with us today.
Adios.